Welcome, everyone. Stacey, Rebecca, you ready for me to start? That's great. It's cutting out a little bit on my end, so I don't know if it is for everybody. Okay, great. Well, welcome, everybody. We're thrilled that you're with us on this very special evening. My name is Kim Schneider-Malik. I am both parent of two actives that are on the regional board here in the Rocky Mountain region, and we're based in Denver. Henry and Jacob Malik are their names, and an alum, Molly Malik, who graduated high school last year and was very active. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Parent Advisory Council, which is the council that is privileged to bring you these programs. And I'd like to introduce you to my co-chair, who will explain our program tonight, Stacey Marlowe.
Hi, I'm Stacey Marlowe. I am the parent of a current Hudson Valley region regional board member and two regional alumni from Hudson Valley. I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. It's been 58 days since the tragic events of October 7th devastated Israel and the Jewish community at large. We are all grieving in different ways and experiencing emotions across the spectrum as our teens. Tonight, our conversation will begin with a brief presentation from Rabbi Ron Fish of the ADL, followed by a moderated question and answer with Drew Fidler, Senior Director for BBYO's Center for Adolescent Wellness. She and Rabbi Fish will discuss how to help your teen navigate anti-Semitism and anti-Israel rhetoric with their peers on social media and at school. Rabbi Ron Fish serves as the ADL's first East Division Director of Anti-Semitism Education and Advocacy, impacting Jewish communities from Maine to Delaware. His central role is addressing anti-Semitism on college campuses today and to offer support for young adults during the first years of independence. His work is directed toward helping directors of equity and inclusion, provosts and university presidents to understand the experience of Jewish students on campus and their unique and diverse needs. Ron is a graduate of Brandeis University and the Jewish Theological Seminary. He has served as congregational rabbi in 3 communities in the Northeast for 25 years. He is currently the president of the Massachusetts Board of Rabbis and has worked through the years as a committed and enthusiastic partner for interfaith dialogue. Thank you to all of you who wrote in with questions for tonight's conversation. We will do our best to get to as many as we can. If you have additional questions as the program goes on, please send them directly to the participant named Question for Speaker, and we will try to get them. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Rabbi Ron Fish.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you, and it's wonderful to see such a large turnout. It's not surprising that the moment we're in is one of great interest in the question of how we talk to our children and how do we prepare them for a world in which there is no question anti-Semitism is on the rise. As you heard, I served for 25 years in congregational pulpits. I also grew up as the child of a congregational rabbi, and I thought of myself as working in a rabbinic space that was focused on joy, focused on meaning and the celebration of Jewish identity. And sometimes, I must confess, I thought it was a mistake to spend too much time talking about anti-Semitism. The truth is, I think many of our institutions have spent a good deal of the last few years asking themselves a question: did we adequately prepare ourselves, not just our children, but did we prepare ourselves for the moment we find ourselves in? I'm not only speaking about October 7th and the atrocities that were committed on October 7th. I'm talking about Charlottesville, where cries of "Jews will not replace us" rang out in an American town, a university town. I'm talking about the 11 dead in Pittsburgh at a synagogue on Shabbat morning. I'm talking about even when Jews are not directly the targets of acts of hate. For instance, in Buffalo, where 11 African Americans were murdered last year at the Tops grocery store. Even in those cases, where the perpetrator somehow, in his screed, links the nefarious conspiratorial Jewish community to the things he's standing up against. How is it possible that in 2023, we're still here? And what do we need to do to prepare ourselves and our kids, given this reality? Well, the truth is that in my 2 years almost with the Anti-Defamation League, we have seen extraordinary data. Among the best things that the ADL does is track with great precision what is happening out there. We track specific incidents, and through our 25 regional offices, we help support people who have been the targets of anti-Semitic acts of harassment, violence, or vandalism. But we also measure opinions. And the opinions we have marked over the course of the last year have reached nearly the highest level of anti-Semitic attitudes we've ever seen. These anti-Semitic attitudes have not been on the rise throughout the course of the last decades. It's only within the last 10 years or so that anti-Semitic attitudes have risen to such a degree. And perhaps most disturbingly, what is in fact very much opposite past trends is that today it is younger people who are more likely to hold anti-Semitic views than their peers were in the recent past. Historically, typically, as one went through the chart of ages and anti-Semitic attitudes, the younger meant the greater likelihood that these people did not hold anti-Jewish views. But today, of the 11 tropes we measure through our Center on Antisemitism Research, the 11 tropes about Jews that we use to measure what people might believe about us. Are we disloyal? Are we people that can't be trusted? Are we willing to take advantage of others for our own benefit? If you trace 6 of those 11, which is the marker we use for having significantly anti-Semitic attitudes, today the answer is 20% of Americans hold those views. This is nothing to do with October 7th. This has nothing to do with Israel defending itself in the face of the worst anti-Semitic violence since the Holocaust. This is a growing trend that we need to take seriously. So how do we do that? How do we respond? Well, of course, situations differ. And as children go through their K-12 experience and then transition into college, the nature of that challenge can look different. There are, of course, many schools I'm sure the parents on this call may recognize, where there's a stray swastika that's found or there's a comment. I think it's important to say, especially for younger children, our job should be to encourage education. ADL works with K through 12 schools to prepare them to learn about bias in our midst and the dangers of bias, to work to create a context in which students are not bystanders, but they are able to be the kind of partners in fighting against all kinds of hate that will benefit everyone. Jews have always benefited from what we call in the ADL our integrated mission, fighting against the defamation of the Jewish people and for just and fair treatment for all. That integrated mission is now more important than ever. And so we teach about anti-LGBTQ plus hate. We talk about what the Asian community has recently experienced. We talk about anti-Black hate, and we talk about Islamophobia as all of the nexus of belief systems in which someone else is to blame where others, minorities, suffer. And those inevitably trace back to Jews. We should, in the K-12 space and even into college, assume that our job is mostly to try to unpack where bias exists, why bias exists, and what we can do to approach the challenge of living in a diverse and a richly interwoven world where there are people who look at and pray and think differently and accept that and embrace that. And that's probably priority number 1. But priority number 2 and this is particularly, I think, our job vis-a-vis the Jewish community, is to tell a little bit more of a challenging story, if not a troubling one. The story I think we need to tell ourselves is the reality of Jewish history. I think, and this is where I'm going to mea culpa myself, as they say, I'm going to speak of my own mistakes. I think we, in some ways, err on the side of Jewish joy to the exclusion of telling the truth about much of Jewish experience. We even often teach the Holocaust as if it's an event entirely surrounded by an impermeable membrane. It was a standout experience in history, the likes of which we'd never seen before. Of course, the suffering in the Shoah is without parallel, but at the same time, it has roots that go back thousands of years, and those roots were not severed after the Holocaust. We did not begin afresh just because American Jews have had a good period in this country and on this continent, and it did not end just with the flourishing of the state of Israel, which thank God exists. The truth is that these roots that see Jews as somehow different, somehow involved in conspiracies that undermine the well-being of the world, they have existed in many ways in the most adaptive form for each generation, but they've existed throughout all of these millennia in which Jewish communities have found ourselves under attack. Where does it trace to? I would argue that a lot of the story must begin with unpacking the origin story of Christianity. Of course, not all Christians are anti-Semites, God forbid. Lots of my work has been with fellow clergy people who are wonderful people and who fight against all kinds of hate, including anti-Semitism. But the origins of the Christian church had to do with the separation from the sister community from which they grew, and they often drew those lines in particularly abrupt and shocking ways, speaking against even the humanity of Jews. It took Augustine in the 4th century to say Jews should be allowed to live, but we should permit them to live only in kind of a second-class status. That was the card that allowed us entry into Western civilization after the emergence of a successful expansion of Christianity. And unrelated to the religion itself, over the course of the millennia, Judaism and Jews were seen as always somehow a force to be viewed skeptically, to be viewed critically, to be viewed as a kind of a source of danger to the larger world, to the human experience of our neighbors. This suspicion about Jews, and particularly about Jewish power, was so pervasive that in certain ways, I think even you and I absorb it. We can't help it. We live in this larger Western culture. How can we avoid it? So when you watch the news and you see Bernie Madoff being arrested, did you think to yourself, "Oy, what a problem for the Jewish community"? When you see politicians or famous people engaging in activity that you don't love, is your first question, are they Jewish? And what does that mean about my relationship to the larger Jewish community? The truth is, you and I probably asked that question for a lot of reasons. We carry with us with a historic memory that goes back far beyond our birth. But the questions we ask really, in some ways, are premised on the notion that somehow Jewish power is suspect, that Jewish expressions of identity perhaps need to be curbed, that Judaism itself and the Jews who live in a Jewish community are forces that need to be understood as potentially disruptive. And it would be better to just kind of dial it down a bit. Those views, which I think hide deep in the psyche of Jews, they're actually present in the larger community in ways that have continued to see Jews, and particularly Jewish power, as suspicious. This is the explanation for why, in the early part of the 20th century, Jews could be blamed for both one thing and its opposite. Right? The beginning of the 20th century, Jews were sometimes accused of being communists and undermining the central economic order, and also for being capitalists and benefiting too much from the existing economic order. Jews were accused of being too religious and superstitious, and then sometimes accused of being too globalist and universalist in our worldview. These conspiracies don't really make sense, but they are pervasive. And what's most, I think, troubling is that we've seen a resurgence of these kinds of conspiracy theories over the course of the past years. If you take a look at QAnon on the right, you will see familiar tropes. They don't always talk about the Jews, but there are often instances where this right-wing conspiracy theory echoes and repeats some of the tropes which we even saw in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, that famous forgery from the beginning of the 20th century. And it's perhaps not a surprise that certain people have even articulated that, whether it's George Soros or the Rothschilds, even in our moment in 2023, those are the faces and the names that are associated with this conspiracy theory. And at the same time, it's really important, no matter your politics, to be honest about the problems that we've seen emerge on the left. A year and a half before the attack of October 7th, in the Boston area where I live, was the Boston Mapping Project. The Boston Mapping Project came along and explained all kinds of evils in the world, including anti-Black police violence, including oppression of people at the southern border. It explained all of this in a global network at which the center was the Jewish community and relationship to the state of Israel. ADL was centrally named in this Boston Mapping Project, as were multiple universities, and by implication, and sometimes explicitly, a Jewish day school, Jewish institutions, Jewish philanthropies, and the CJP, our federation in town. All of these players were literally mapped. They were named, and some of them were given addresses. And this was published to the world, and the readers were told it was their job to dismantle and disrupt this network, this map that supports genocide and murder, that supports all the evils that can be seen in our world. So whether it's QAnon or whether it's the Mapping Project, there is somehow a consistent theme that Jews are at the center of what's wrong with our world. And so I don't claim that America is at the worst place in all of history. Obviously not. There are so many ways in which we have access to power and we can tell the truth, but we haven't told ourselves the truth enough, that there is a problem in Western civilization which was not ended with the end of the Shoah, and we need to speak up against conspiracy theories in general, and certainly those conspiracy theories which place at the center of them somehow the nefarious Jew who is in league with the devil to undermine the goodwill of humanity. So that's a lot to lay on our kids. I'm not suggesting we dump all of that on them at once, but I do think it's important to tell the truth. And we haven't done that as consistently as we need to. The truth is that the world we inhabit is filled with dangerous actors. It is a world in which it is necessary for us to speak up against various kinds of evil and persecution. And it's not always easy to identify who is the persecutor and who is the victim simply by looking at who has access to certain forms of power. In the current crisis that we see unfolding in Israel and Gaza, there is no question the Palestinian community has suffered thousands of more deaths. There is no question that Palestinian children are dying, and that is an enormous tragedy. But that doesn't prove that Israel is responsible, and their suffering doesn't prove that the Palestinians are righteous. In fact, the suffering on both sides is clearly and unequivocally the fault of Hamas. And the suffering on both sides is the responsibility of those who took up arms to murder babies and the elderly and to rape and to take people hostage by the thousands. The crimes of October 7th and the aftermath all are at the feet of the Palestinians. But in order to tell that story, we need to be careful. Because, of course, it is not all Palestinians who are guilty. It is the actors. It is Hamas. And we need to be careful because Israel does have power and can make mistakes. And we need to teach our children how to love and support the Jewish people, the Jewish state, to fight with dignity and responsibility, but to do so in a way that is willing to take in information. Too often in my work in colleges, we find that many Jewish students have never heard some of the story of how Israel came to be. They don't really understand the nuances of the historical processes that produce the state of Israel. And they come to understand that there's a people that is suffering, that is right next to Israel, which seems to be flourishing. If we don't teach the complexities of the story, we don't leave our children prepared to encounter those challenges and to figure out what to do with them. What we need to do to prepare our children to enter into a complex world is to give them love of our Jewish identity, to give them passion, but to teach them that this is also going to involve work. Because anything that is valuable really does involve effort. Anything that is valuable includes the responsibility to make it your own. Our Jewish students have the ability to do this. I've seen it, and my breath has been taken away again and again by extraordinary young people. I'll tell you a few stories about college, not that all of your students, or not that all of your children are currently at the university, but I'll tell you a few stories because they are likely headed there if they're not there already. I'll tell you the story of a young woman who was a founder of her a cappella group at the University of Connecticut. And she posted online that she identified with the state of Israel. She was a Zionist. And when she did that, she was thrown out of the a cappella group that she had formed. Rather than simply kind of being ashamed, being angry, letting go of the whole desire to be part of this conversation, this young woman stood up. She became a figure in discourse on the nature of what we see on college campuses. And she is a woman who spoke up for her right to be who she is. I'll tell you another story about a young man at Tufts University who was on the elected to student council. And part of his role included being part of a judiciary committee for students who might be accused of any kind of wrongdoing that would appear before them. He was a proud Zionist, and he spoke up on behalf of Israel. A group of students tried to impeach him because they said he couldn't be fair in his work on this student council. And so he was, in fact, they tried to remove him as someone who didn't belong in this space. This young man fought back. He wrote letters, he met with the administration, and he not only ended up being allowed to stay on, he was reelected to his place on the student council. These students had an idea of who they were, and they were willing to stand up and fight on behalf of their identity. That is the kind of story that should give us hope. Our students, all of them, have that ability. The challenge right now is that when they walk into a library, if students are screaming that Zionists don't belong here, Zionists go to hell, which just happened this evening at the New School in Manhattan, if that happens to our students and they don't know the context of the conflict, they don't know the context of historic anti-Semitism, and they don't have a deep sense of how this all fits together for them in their own experience, they will be lost. But if we give them the tools, they have the strength, they have the ability, they have the capacity. It's almost Hanukkah, and it couldn't be a more perfect time to share this truth. The story of Hanukkah is the story not just of a cruse of oil. The story of Hanukkah is the story of a light that we carry, each of us within. And when you think that light is weak and susceptible to the slightest breeze, you're afraid to bring it out into the world, you only allow darkness to triumph. When you know that that light is strong and it can be shared with others, not only does that light survive, it spreads light and it becomes the source of light in a dark time. The prayer I have before this Hanukkah is in this very dark, very challenging time, that we cultivate the lights in our kids. We trust them to know the truth about complex issues, and we give them the courage to raise up their lamp to make the darkness less oppressive and more filled with hope. There's going to be more in our conversation about how we help our kids specifically. I don't want to leave just on the message that we have to fight. I also want to give you a little bit of good news. The good news is that on campus after campus, including the ones where I see the most challenges, I see joyous Jewish life happening, maybe even more so than before. Some students have been afraid to show their Magen David or to walk around with a kippah or to wear a Hillel sweatshirt or a BBYO sweatshirt. But many, many more are taking them out of the closet, are buying a new Magen David. Maybe you'll get one for your kids this Hanukkah, are stepping up and saying, I'm not hiding anywhere. That is an act of real and clear hope. I've talked to Hillel directors across the country where their Hillels are filled with kids who have come for Shabbat dinners, where they're coming by the droves to identify who they are. And although it's a difficult time, this might bring out the strength in our people as well. I want you to know that the difficult times we're facing, we've seen before and much worse. We have the capacity, we have the strength, we have the light. Don't fear, just move forward with confidence.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Ron. And, I am looking forward to diving in a little bit more with you in conversation. And just wanted to remind everyone, if you have any questions, please feel free to chat them at questions for speaker as we're moving forward. Ron, as you were just talking about both needing the tools, right? And really being able to advocate or have our kids be able to advocate. And so, I come to this question of what tools should parents be giving their kids, right? How can a parent help their teen or help coach their teen who, whether they are confronting it in the classroom from a teacher, right, who's using class to put forth their anti-Zionist or anti-Semitic views, or from peers, what are the tools that a parent can help to coach or give their teen right now to sort of help them be in a better position to advocate for themselves and potentially for others?
So I'll share a few thoughts here. First of all, I think it's true across the board. Whatever kind of hate challenges children are going to face, there is a part of parenting which involves preparing kids to enter the world on their own 2 feet. Maybe I've seen this in my work pastorally as well. This is why I've been thinking about this. But I think that often when parents have a child who comes out as gay, the first thing that may occur to a parent is, will they face difficulty? Will they face challenges in the world? And so they give them love, they give them hopefully a lot of support, but they also prepare them in whatever way they can to understand what it is to represent your well-being as you enter the world. To be a Jew requires they're taking on certain kinds of learning, certain kinds of understanding about the world they're going to enter. And not all of it has to come from home. But we should, first of all, ask our religious schools, ask our public schools to properly teach history and to include in history the components of Jewish experience as refugees, as a people that has experienced through different eras and different places, expulsion and sometimes attack and murder, to teach those stories, not that they should be afraid, but they should understand the strength of the ancestors that they carry within them. The reality is that we're here because our ancestors survived, and we carry their spirit. So that can be an affirmative thing. I've seen my African-American friends talk about telling similar stories when they learn about the experience of slavery and Jim Crow. It's important to instill in your children, number one, the knowledge that can come in partnership with schools, and also the spirit of strength that goes along with it. In addition, there are resources that are available now from a range of institutions. ADL's produced a couple of really great things I want to just make sure you know about. One is called Antisemitism Uncovered. It's a video series of 7 videos, I believe 7, maybe 6, which cover different anti-Semitic myths and tropes that have existed through history. They're very accessible. They're quite short. You can watch them with your kids. You can talk about them. Even I think children, I would say as young as 8 or 9, would be able to have conversations around these themes in a really supportive and meaningful way. As children get older, another resource I can share with you is something called Think, Plan, Act. It's specifically designed for college students to do their own advocacy on campus. They can understand a little bit of the definition of anti-Semitism. Sometimes students don't even know it when they see it. And it provides them with resources for how to talk to the administration, how to reach out, and how to understand. I'll tell you, when I was growing up, I grew up in Southern Virginia. And when I was there, a kid put a swastika on my locker when I was about 13. I dismissed it. I thought it was just bullying. You know, people are mean sometimes, and kind of get used to that when you're in middle school. It's tough time. It didn't even occur to me until decades later that wasn't a random act. I was identified as a Jew. My father was a rabbi. And I wanted to push away the idea that it could have been an anti-Semitic act. I think sometimes the victims of harassment do the same thing, sometimes with sexual harassment, sometimes with other kinds of interactions. There are psychological attempts to protect yourself by saying, I wasn't the victim of something serious that has a name like anti-Semitism, but it's okay. We should be able to tell people they'll be okay. They won't be destroyed by it. They can get up afterwards, but that was not okay. And the word for what you've just experienced is Jew hate or anti-Semitism. And we have seen that before. So giving kids the permission to see it, to recognize it, tools to understand it, and the strength to get through it is what we need to do.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I heard you name a couple of things that from the therapist's perspective, right? From the clinician chair where I sit, I start to hear you talking about the struggle muscle, right? A little bit of that push and pull, as well as something that is so core to identity development and building of resiliency as we look at it, is this idea of being able to know one's narrative and know one's story. So that's something that, right, as a therapist, we talk a lot about that is something that helps someone to build their resiliency, a sense of identity, a sense of where they come from, right? All of those pieces that are so key and actually are positive, right? What we call positive childhood experiences, which counteract adverse childhood experiences or help to counteract those pieces. So I think it's really interesting that, it doesn't matter whether it is anti-Semitism or simply trying to build an individual, right? Build a strong teen in the world, that these are some core pieces of how we can help them to grow. As you were talking, you mentioned this idea of, helping them to really understand their story, to understand some of the background around where they come from, around, the state of Israel as well. What are some resources that you recommend for really being able to learn that story that provides an understanding of how the Palestinian narrative interfaces with our narrative, right? Really acknowledging that other side without letting go of our absolute commitment to Israel's right to exist.
So important. And the truth is, this gives me an opportunity also to say something else in addition, which I think is really important. And that is, many students who are out there today experiencing the anti-Zionism in its extreme form are also noticing that sometimes the people who are doing the protesting are their friends and people who share values with them. And that that's a struggle. That's a real challenge. And sometimes it's even other Jewish students who are protesting Israel. And that makes it even harder to navigate. What is it I'm seeing, and how do I make sense of this? In fact, the levels of identification with Zionism in the United States among American Jews is about 80%, but it drops significantly if you're talking about the under 30 crowd. And if you ask about elite universities, it's even lower. And so the question of how do we make sense of the fact that it might be people who share my values who are protesting what I think is part of my core identity? How do I make sense of the fact that other Jews might be out there? And how do I make sense of the fact that these things which I've been raised to love seem to be accused of some of the worst things I can imagine? So I think it is an incredibly difficult terrain for students to navigate without a prior understanding of some of the complexities of Jewish identity and the complexities of Israel. So first, I would suggest it's really important to take time to unpack what Jewish identity means. You may all have remembered last year, I think a couple of times, Whoopi Goldberg said something about the fact that the Holocaust wasn't racist. It was one group of white people killing another group of white people, which was very, very stupid. She doubled down on it, unfortunately. I don't think Whoopi Goldberg is an anti-Semite. I think it was an incredibly foolish thing for her to say, but it does reflect the fact that the broader context in which we discuss Israel or Jewish identity is race as it's understood in America. And race as it's understood in America, for very obvious reasons, is built around this black-white dichotomy. But the whole world is not built on this black-white dichotomy. And actually, the concept of race grew up in Europe in significant measure around the question of how to see Jews. Race as an idea was core to seeing Jews as fundamentally other. So one thing to understand, if we just dive into Israel and politics, I think we're going to have a tough time unpacking what's going on. The first question to ask is, what is a Jew? What is Jewish identity in relationship to the broader community we live in? The historic answer to that question is we were a community that was a bit separate for a range of reasons from the people with whom we lived, sometimes out of hate and animus, sometimes because we were simply different. But the idea as nationalism began, that Jews as a different community, separate race, a separate nation in the midst of Europe, was an obvious truth to everybody in Europe who was asking the question. Sometimes the answer was an affirmative Jewish one that said, yes, we have an affirmative identity and we have an expression of that identity. And sometimes it was by anti-Semites who wanted to murder us. But the reality that Jews were a separate community was so obvious that it was an easy notion that was put before the world that the Jews should perhaps consider building their own state, this place which did not have a state. It was filled with some people, for sure. They were Arabs at the time who identified as part of a larger Syria, Greater Syria. They were part of the Turkish Empire. But at the beginning of the Zionist project, there was no state there. And the Jews who chose to begin the project that we call the building of the State of Israel and modern Zionism were premising it on the fact that here was a community in a land where there was no state and a land where there already were significant Jewish communities. The actual challenge that I think we face on college campuses right now is the framing of Israel as a colonialist outsider that is placed in the middle of this indigenous community. And in that framing, there's no way to unpack how Zionism could possibly be good. If you begin the question about a time before there were nations, when there are lots of people all over the Middle East, when Baghdad is about a third Jewish, when Basra is almost half Jewish, when Jews fill all the major cities in the Middle East, and there was a desire to create new states based upon common identities, the idea that there would be a carving out of different spaces for different groups as different nations made sense. And understanding that prehistory reframes us not as a strange foreign group of white Europeans who colonized the Middle East where there were brown people, but as an indigenous community with ambiguous national borders all over that was involved in a compromise policy of sharing land in order for multiple ethnicities and peoples to live side by side. The great tragedy is, of course, in 1936, in what's very little remembered, the Peel Commission, in 1947 with the United Nations, through 1967, when the land was easily split between different options or different political powers, there was no desire to build a Palestinian state. It was just desire to destroy the Jewish one. And so the story then has to turn to, how do we share the land? How do we accept both narratives and both realities? And how do we build this shared experience? It begins by taking off Whoopi Goldberg's lenses which are distorting, that see the world in a purely dichotomous way, where Jews are either white or black. In fact, the story is that Jews are indigenous to the Middle East. Jews have communities consistently in an unbroken chain throughout thousands of years in the land of Israel. And the process of building the state, which was messy and complicated and continues, is a process which is familiar to anyone that studied any of the beginnings of nations in that period. The last thing I'll say is, I think it's important to leave space for people who don't want to adopt the standard Jewish advocacy position on Israel. We have to leave space for our children who are asking tough questions. We have to leave space for them to be part of the Jewish conversation, even if they push some boundaries for some of us. And the reason for that is, number one, many of them are working out their own thoughts in their own time. The answer number two is, some of them have really good answers and they have good challenges, and we need to hear them. And the answer number three is, we don't have children to waste. Even when people disagree on some fundamental things, they can still be allies in fighting against anti-Semitism. And we need them to do that, to work together, even when they might disagree on some other pieces of the political question of the moment.
So how can a parent potentially engage? And then I want to get to college in just a minute, so we'll keep this one brief. But how can a parent potentially engage in a conversation with their teen or even college student who, whether they have contradicting views, whether they are upset with the parent's position, whether they feel, I had a parent say to me the other day, they feel that the parent is too pro-Israel and not leaving any space for the teen to have other opinions or views. How can a parent engage in conversation with that teen to both hear, right, to take this, give space to hear what they're saying, and almost become, not necessarily the advocate, but to have a real conversation with that teen?
Yeah. So this is my answer, but I think we all have to kind of work on this. This is not something you're going to get from an official, from an expert. This is something you're going to come to through knowing your own child, and through caring about the outcome in a range of ways. My answer to the question is, and I have 4 children, 2 of whom are in college right now. One's in law school, one's in high school. I get plenty of challenges, trust me. The thing I think is necessary, it goes back to what my teacher in rabbinical school, Rabbi Lebo, said, is to be a non-anxious presence, to be able to be present with your child, to be present with anyone in a way that is filled with compassion and integrity. And loving Israel doesn't mean not being able to hear anything that criticizes Israel. That anxiety is going to create a necessary reaction. Trying to be a lover of the state of Israel today, without broaching any questions, it's honestly not very Jewish. It's certainly not the way Israel is in most moments, perhaps not at this particular moment. But last summer when I was in Israel, I attended some of the protests. Half the country was on the street protesting. Half the country was on the street protesting. I without taking a position on the politics of any given issue, why should we be surprised that thoughtful, independent, intelligent people are asking questions. That's fine. That's appropriate. Israel is strong enough and healthy enough to endure that. What I would say is I want my children and I want your children to know that Zionism is not white supremacy. Zionism is not fascism. Some of the things you're hearing that echo in the halls of college campuses. Zionism is the radical idea that Jews are human beings with the same agency as other human beings. That's really at core what Zionism is. It was the idea that Jews have a national liberation movement with the same responsibilities and the same integrity as other national liberation movements. That's, I think, some of the distortion that's gone on. It's this claim that there's something nefarious and different about it. And this is why anti-Zionism can be anti-Semitism, because when anti-Zionism is saying, I don't agree with Israeli policy, that's not anti-Zionism. That's a difference of opinion on policy. But when anti-Zionism says Jews don't fundamentally have the same right as the Lebanese, as the Greeks, as the Poles, I bring up those because those were not nations 150 years ago. They were reborn after vanishing. When Jews engage in self-realization, self-actualization, when they exercise their own agency in the world, it is as legitimate as with any other people.
I think that was a beautiful, unofficial, for not being an official answer. It was a pretty good one. I'll give you that.
Thank you.
So as we, you mentioned you've got a kid on a law school campus, you've got two kids on college campuses at the moment. And, I think many of the parents that are with us tonight, whether they have teens who are headed to college or teens on college campuses, they're looking to these campuses and trying to figure out how to choose what's best suited for them, for their child, right? What should families be really mindful of when considering life as a Jewish student on college campus?
Yeah, we've been asked a lot for a report card for campuses, and we're very reluctant to do it. And the reason is reducing the complex nature of a particular campus to a grade about the negative things going on there will miss a lot. And it's actually distorting. So I'll give you an example. My son is at Columbia. Columbia has been filled with really, really difficult things. There was an evening at the beginning, right after the start of the war, where Jewish students were told not to leave the Hillel building because they were afraid that the group outside was going to physically attack them. It turned out to have been probably a bit of a miscommunication, and the people outside who were Palestinian protesters were not actually outside because it was the Hillel building. It was having to do with they were marching around and they kind of got stopped at one spot. It was an accident. But it was so intense that literally these students were told by their adult responsible leaders, don't go outside because a Jew might get hurt. Like, that's how bad it was that night at Columbia. And it's not just that one night. There was just an event that was scheduled. Thankfully, I think it was just canceled, that was going to be teaching about how wonderful and necessary the violence of October 7th was, and how any liberation requires this kind of violence, including, by the way, what they called anti-imperial violence, which suggests that violence could come to these shores, could come to Columbia itself. So if you want a grade on Columbia, I can't avoid scoring these things pretty high. But I got to tell you, they have one of the most remarkable Hillels. They have extraordinary Jewish life, and they have a range of services that really speak to the breadth of what it is to be a Jew on campus. Plus, they have programs where you can study in Israel. They have programs you can study at the Jewish Theological Seminary, where my son studies. They have all of these programs. So if you look at the positive side of the ledger, there's a lot to say it's an outstanding place to be. I don't know any grading system that can take such divergent sets of inputs and give it one score.
You miss the nuance.
You miss the nuance, and you miss what the university has or hasn't done. Because sometimes the campus is quiet, but it's not because the administration has been a wonderful friend. And sometimes the campus is really roiling, and it's not because the administration has done nothing. And I think it's necessary for us. I actually had a friend who works in this space. Anybody's going to give advice to a child or to a family about where to go for college has to first begin by saying, what does my child need? So some campuses are filled with political activism, and maybe that's not your child's thing, pro-Israel or anti-Israel. Maybe your child needs a place to go to the library and work on trigonometry or whatever comes after trigonometry, because that wasn't what I did. Maybe your child is very active and wants a place where there's lots of activism. Maybe your child needs a place where there's lots of Jewish services, or maybe your child is happy to be a proud Jew without all of those Jewish services. You need to make those decisions as a first kind of question, and then that will point you to the right direction. There are campuses that have been going through quite a lot. The Title VI now of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VI protects Jewish students and entitles them, guarantees them the right to an equitable presence on campus, meaning that if there's harassment, if they are feeling that they can't get to class because they have to walk through a gauntlet of outrageous anti-Zionist claims about the genocide, and if they are constantly berated, told Zionists don't belong, the university has to respond and create a space in which they are protected. That's the law that is applied by the Department of Education. And there are a number of universities where there are currently Title VI claims being brought against universities. That's accessible on the Department of Education website. You can see what schools those are. You can come to us, you can come to me. I'll be happy to help you with that as well. And we will help you navigate where there are challenges. But the truth is, there are challenges. There are challenges everywhere. And I'm not sure seeking campus without challenges is likely to result in an educated child. One last sentence. I don't want to give up on university. I am really scared when I hear some people say, and I don't think they mean it, Jews shouldn't go to universities anymore. It's too difficult. Our success in the West, in America in particular, in the last century, and we've had lots of success,
on education,
is founded on education. And if we give up on higher education, it will be to the detriment of the Jewish people and to the world. We have work to do to make those places better.
And, whether it is on the college campus or even in a high school, what response can, students look for from whether it's a university administration or otherwise that shows that they're taking the issue seriously, that they're responding to, right? How can they both, I guess, I'm going to revise my question to you. How can they both engage in the conversation, and what kind of signals should they look for from administrators or administrations to be able to know that they're listening, taking it seriously, and moving these issues forward?
We have asked every university to do a number of things, and you should follow up to find out whether they've done these things and similar things, which other organizations are asking as well. We've asked universities to define anti-Semitism. That is actually a harder thing to ask university to do than you might think. There's a lot of controversy about the IRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition. Some academics don't like it as much, some like it more. We think it is a useful tool, but guess what? It's not about who thinks it's a useful tool or not. It's actually the tool that the Department of Education is using to look at schools and to see whether they are abiding by their obligations vis-a-vis their Jewish students. So they should know for their own benefit that the IRA definition is the definition used by the federal government to determine whether they are protecting Jewish students. We ask them to include Jews in their DEI mandate, the Directors of Equity and Inclusion. We ask them to ensure that there's a process that is clear in the university for reporting incidents, and that those incidents, when they get reported, that there be as much transparency as possible. A real problem is when students get to be victimized because of their identity, and then they're gaslit by the university saying There's no problem here. That existed at the University of Vermont for quite a while. There were a number of rounds of Jewish students who were raising their hand saying, this is a really difficult place to be a Jew. And the university kept saying, no, it's not. It's fine. Well, guess what? The University of Vermont, there was a Title VI case.
Get your own phone.
There was a Title VI case brought.
Get your own phone.
And there was a consent decree. And it was a night and day.
Hold on one second. I think we need a little tech help. Just one moment, and I think you're good. Go ahead.
Good.
Keep going.
So we need to make sure that, as in the case of the University of Vermont, we have universities that know who Jews are, that they're committed to protecting them, that they talk about it, and we also, sometimes this whole question about statements after October 7th gets a little lost. It's not that universities need to say that they have their answer to the Middle East conflict, but they need to say the truth when people are victimized and when people feel endangered, that they care about their students. And that's part of the problem. At UMass Amherst, when a Jewish student was beaten up after a Shabbat table display where they had empty seats for the hostages, the president foolishly came out with a statement saying, we stand against anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Now, the university should stand against Islamophobia, but when a Jewish student was beaten, that's a form of gaslighting. That's saying we don't really see you in your particularity. We're concerned about all things is easy. We care about you is what they need to say. There are other asks we have. One of them is we asked universities to look at SJPs to see that they're not violating the standards of conduct. The Students for Justice in Palestine, they're entitled to advocate for their beliefs, but when they violate codes of conduct that are part of the university structure, when they take over buildings, when they don't allow classes to exist, when they don't allow people to pass into the library without being essentially harassed, that's a violation of the code of conduct. The university must enforce the code of conduct. There are other requests we have which get a little more technical, but I think if you ask the universities you're looking at, what is the DEI mandate vis-a-vis Jews? Have you defined anti-Semitism? And what is it that Jewish students can do if they feel they've been harassed? If you get good answers to those questions, that's a lot. That's a lot.
Well, Rabbi, I want to thank you for taking the time to answer some of our questions and some of everyone's questions, and it's been wonderful speaking with you. I've
loved speaking with you. I wish everybody happy Hanukkah. I want to be the joyous rabbi again. We need to be filled with light, and maybe especially at difficult times.
Well, and I will turn it over to Kim to wrap us up. Thank you.
Thank you, Drew. Both of you, excellent. Thank you for sharing this essential information with us, Rabbi Fish, and Drew for bringing us the lens of flourishing humans and how important and meaningful this conversation has been. BBYO staff members, advisors, and mental health professionals are always available for your teens. And we really want to emphasize that access to these professionals, and there are mental health and emotional health resources that are available. And there will be links sent out to you, links embedded here, to make sure that we continue as parents supporting the kids who journey both in BBYO and beyond, and besides. Sometimes some of you may be parents who haven't yet joined or don't have kids who have yet found traction in the organization. We encourage you to use our resources and realize that we are supporting your kids every way we possibly can. The BBYO Parent Advisory Council is here to advance BBYO efforts to develop and strengthen a global community of parents, BBYO parents, and to provide opportunities for parents to engage both locally and nationally to share your ideas and support your teens. We have that conflicting commitment that we're driving our teens to participate and to do it, to individuate and differentiate and find their own footing around leadership, but yet we also need to be engaged and involved as parents. So we encourage you to reach out to us and reach out to your communities. Throughout the year, we'll host these different events, likely have something else around this topic, because many of the questions will morph, as Rabbi Fish said. What exists today as our crisis question may evolve and organically change. So we'll continue to address critical questions like this and ways that we can continue to support each other. And we'll have several events in the new year. You'll get a calendar for those. I just want to thank you, Rabbi Fish, as we all leave this, to say we will work on telling our truth to our kids. We'll work on cultivating the light that they have and teaching them and allowing them to spread that light. We'll teach confidence and capacity, and in that confidence vein, hope that they are able to take what comes at them and rise with resilience above that. Drew, you suggested that there was a theme of building that struggle muscle, and we'll continue to look at ways that we can help our rising youth build that muscle and unpack their Jewish identity. And we all bring different narratives to that. So we'll work on storytelling and helping our parents and our kids go down that path. And finally, we'll leave space for our kids as we all journey off this call to, I think, Rabbi, you said, to go out there and allow them to have the presence of their own mind, which may be different than our minds as parents. And how do we encourage them to think Jewishly, which includes the spirit of inquiry. So with all of that, we wish you well. We appreciate the extra 2 minutes, and we'll look forward to all of you being here. And Rabbi Ron, we'll look forward to tapping into your brilliance again, both fortunately and unfortunately. And Drew, you're always here to serve us, and we greatly appreciate that as well. And with that, I bid you good evening, and we'll look forward to seeing you again. We'll see you again shortly, and happy holidays to everyone.
Thank you.